My name is Augustus Holloway. I'm 74 years old, and 48 hours ago I buried my wife of 45 years. This morning her husband, my son-in-law, stood in the living room of the house I built with my own two hands and told me to pack my bags. He said my time as a guest was over. I walked out without saying a word. He thought he had won. He thought I was going to a shelter, a broken old man with nowhere to go. He had no idea I was on my way to the bank to open a safe deposit box that contained the blueprint for his complete and total destruction. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit that like and subscribe button if you believe it's never too late to fight for what is rightfully yours. The morning after Lorraine's funeral, the silence in the house was so absolute I could hear the dust settling. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, like a thick blanket pressing down on my chest. The scent of lilies from the sympathy arrangement still hung in the air, a sickeningly sweet reminder of the woman who had filled every corner of this house with her laughter and warmth for nearly half a century. I sat in the leather armchair in the living room, a chair I'd chosen myself, positioned in the perfect spot to catch the morning sun. Every inch of this house held a piece of me. I didn't just build it. I had breathed life into it. From the pitch of the roof to the grade of the oak flooring, it was an extension of who I was, my testament in brick and mortar to a life of hard work. It was the temple I built for my Queen Lorraine. My eyes were fixed on our wedding photo above the fireplace. Lorraine radiant in her white dress, and me, a skinny young man with eyes full of blueprints and bigger dreams. We had built all of this from nothing, from a whispered promise in the dark. Now half of that dream was gone, and the silence she left behind was deafening. The soft click of a porcelain cup on the marble coffee table pulled me from my thoughts. Preston, my son-in-law, had entered the room. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray business suit, looking as though he was heading to a board meeting, not like a man who had just buried his mother-in-law. Not a single crease, not a hint of grief or exhaustion. In his hand was a tiny cup of espresso, its strong foreign scent an intruder in a house that only knew the smell of my percolated coffee and Lorraine's chamomile tea. He didn't sit. He stood there in the middle of my living room, surveying it with the cold eyes of an appraiser. His gaze swept over the paintings, the furniture, not with appreciation, but with calculation. "Gus," he began, his voice flat, devoid of any real emotion, "I know this is a difficult time." What a cliché. What did he know about difficult times? For him, a difficult time was a dip in the stock market. For me, it was the feeling of my chest being ripped open, of having to learn how to breathe again when one of your lungs has been torn out. I didn't answer. I just watched him waiting. I've learned over the years that the silence of an old black man often unnerves men like Preston. It forces them to fill the void, and that's when they show you exactly who they are. He cleared his throat, placing the cup down. "Lorraine is gone," he said, stating the obvious as if I might have forgotten. He paused for a beat, looking directly at me, and that's when I saw it. Not sympathy, not compassion. It was the impatience of a predator. "Mourn," he continued, each word slow and deliberate. "Pack your things and never come back here again." The words just hung there in the air. For a second, my brain refused to process them. They were too absurd, too cruel to be real. It was like hearing a foreign language. I recognized the individual words, but their collective meaning was too grotesque to comprehend. I thought I must have misheard. Maybe the grief had finally scrambled my senses. I looked at him, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of sick joke, a terrible misunderstanding. But there was nothing. His face was a mask of stone, his cold blue eyes unwavering. "What did you say?" My voice came out as a dry, broken rasp, like stones scraping together. A tiny, almost imperceptible smirk touched one corner of Preston's mouth. It was the smile of victory. "This house," he said, gesturing with an open hand as if to encompass everything. "Everything in it. It was all transferred into an irrevocable trust in Zoe's name 2 years ago. Lorraine agreed. So did you." He let that sink in. "Legally, sir, you have no claim here anymore. You were living here out of the kindness of your wife and now my wife. But Zoe and I have decided it's time for a change. We'll be selling the property." He shrugged. "You're just a guest, and visiting hours are over." A guest. That one word struck me like a physical blow. In my 74 years on this earth, I've been called many things, but never a guest in the home I poured my own sweat and blood and heart into building. A hot, searing rage began to build deep in my chest, but I smothered it. Anger is a luxury a black man can't afford in Preston's world. Anger would make me the villain, the irrational old man, and it would validate whatever story he decided to tell about me later. No, I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. My calm seemed to unsettle him. He had expected shouting, begging, maybe a convenient heart attack. He did not expect silence. I slowly pushed myself to my feet. Every joint in my 74-year-old body protested, but I forced myself to stand tall as I could. I looked him dead in the eye, and this time it was he who looked away first. I didn't say a single word to him, not one accusation, not one plea. Words were useless now. This was not a battle that would be won with words. I walked past him toward the front door. I could feel his eyes on me, following my every step. He was probably thinking he'd won, that the pathetic old man was shuffling off to find some nursing home. I took my old wool coat from the rack, the one Lorraine had bought me for Christmas a decade ago. I put it on, feeling the familiar comfort of the worn fabric. Then I opened the front door and stepped out into the crisp October morning. I did not look back. I got into my old Buick, the car Preston always called the Relic. I turned the key and the familiar, reliable engine rumbled to life. As I backed out of the driveway I had paved myself, I saw Preston standing in the living room window watching me with a smug look on his face. He thought I was going to a friend's house or a cheap motel. He thought I was leaving to pick up the shattered pieces of my life. He was wrong. I wasn't leaving to pack my bags. I was driving to the bank. The safe deposit vault at First National Bank was another world entirely. There was no warm oak or morning sun here, just cold steel polished marble and a sterile silence broken only by the hum of the ventilation and the click of mechanical locks. The air was cold. It reminded me of a morgue. A young bank employee led me to a small private room, placed my heavy metal box on the table, and left, closing the heavy door behind him. I sat there alone, staring at the box. This box held the fragments of my life with Lorraine, the documents too precious to be trusted to anything but steel and a key. My hand trembled slightly as I put the key in the lock and turned. The lid popped open. Inside there were no jewels or gold bars. Our legacy was measured in paper. Old yellowed architectural blueprints, Zoe's birth certificate, our marriage license, and a thick stack of legal documents our lawyer had prepared over the years. I began to sift through them, and the memories flooded back, sharp and painful. And then I found it. The folder Preston had brought over on that summer afternoon 2 years ago. My mind drifted back. Lorraine was on the sofa, wrapped in a wool blanket despite the heat. The first round of chemo had stolen her strength, leaving her terrifyingly frail. Preston sat across from us, the picture of the concerned financial professional. "This is about protecting you both," he'd said in a soft, persuasive voice, flipping through pages filled with legal jargon. "Creating a trust simplifies everything. It shields the assets from massive estate taxes, ensures Zoe is taken care of, and most importantly, it lets you two stop worrying about these things. You just need to focus on getting Mom healthy." And I, consumed with worry for Lorraine, exhausted from sleepless nights and long days at the hospital, I had listened. The words trust and estate planning sounded responsible. Preston was a professional. He was my daughter's husband. Why would we ever doubt him? "All right, Preston," I had said, my voice thick with fatigue. "We trust you." The smile he gave me then, I realize now, wasn't one of relief. It was one of satisfaction. I blinked back in the cold reality of the bank room. My hands moved through the documents, and then I saw it. A single page stapled to the back, almost hidden. It wasn't titled Trust Agreement. I could see it as clearly as if it were yesterday. Preston was holding out a pen. "Just a few final signatures," he'd said, casually pointing to the lines on the thick stack of papers. "This is just standard procedure to authorize the trust to manage the assets." Lorraine was too weak to read. She just signed where he pointed, and my eyes, blurry with exhaustion, had followed her lead. I remembered glancing at the headings: Trust Agreement, Power of Attorney. I trusted him. I trusted the process. I didn't read every word. It was the single greatest mistake of my life. Now, in the harsh fluorescent light of the bank room, I read those words. I read them once and then again, willing them to mean something else. But there was no misunderstanding. The paper stapled to the back was titled in plain, bold letters, Quitclaim Deed. It was a simple, brutally destructive legal instrument. It didn't move the house into a trust to be managed. It stripped me and Lorraine of our ownership entirely and transferred it directly to Zoe Thorne as an irrevocable gift. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't just agreed to let my son-in-law manage my assets. I had signed my own house away. I had signed my life away. The new conflict was established with cruel clarity. I hadn't just been kicked out. I had been legally disarmed, dispossessed of everything by the one man I was supposed to be able to trust. Preston hadn't just used my love for my wife and daughter against me. He had weaponized it. I sat there in the silence of the steel vault with the proof of betrayal in my hands, and I knew this fight wasn't going to be about getting a house back. This was about taking back my dignity. The law office of Nina Rosario was on the 32nd floor of a glass and steel tower downtown. It was a world away from the warm oak and familiar comforts of my home. Her office was clean, modern, and minimalist. Everything was glass chrome and shades of gray. The only color came from the vibrant, abstract paintings on the walls and the deep green of a single perfectly healthy fiddle-leaf fig tree in the corner. Through the floor-to-ceiling window behind her desk, the city sprawled out below a vast grid of concrete and ambition. It felt like a place where emotions were checked at the door, a place where only facts and figures mattered. And right now, that was exactly what I needed. Ms. Rosario herself was as sharp and composed as her surroundings. She was a woman in her early 50s with intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. She listened intently as I laid out the story, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I didn't embellish or get emotional. I just stated the facts one after the other like an architect laying down a foundation. I told her about Lorraine's illness, about Preston's timely offer to help about the trust, and finally about the moment in the bank vault when I discovered the truth. I pushed the quitclaim deed across the vast expanse of her glass desk. It looked small and insignificant in the center of that desk, but I knew it was a document with the power to erase my entire life. She picked it up carefully, her manicured nails tapping softly against the paper. She read it once, then a second time, her expression unreadable. She swiveled in her chair and typed something into her computer, her eyes scanning the screen. The only sound in the room was the soft clicking of her keyboard. The silence stretched on each second, feeling like an hour. I felt a desperate, foolish flicker of hope that she would find some obvious flaw, some simple loophole that would make this all go away. I hoped she would laugh and say, "Oh, Mr. Holloway, this is a common scare tactic. It won't hold up in court for a second." She finally turned back to me, her face calm, professional, and radiating an energy that I immediately recognized as bad news. "Mr. Holloway," she began, her voice even and measured. "I've reviewed the document and run a preliminary check on the property records. On the surface, everything appears to be in order." She saw the look on my face and held up a hand. "Let me be perfectly clear so there are no misunderstandings. A quitclaim deed is a very powerful instrument. It does exactly what its name implies. You quit your claim to the property. You effectively gifted your entire stake in the house to your daughter Zoe." "But I was tricked," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Lorraine was sick. We weren't thinking clearly. Preston told us it was for a trust to protect us." Ms. Rosario nodded slowly, her expression one of professional sympathy. "I have no doubt that's true," she said. "And morally what he did is despicable. But the law, unfortunately, is not always concerned with morality. It's concerned with contract signatures and what can be proven in court." She leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. "Let's look at this from the perspective of a judge. Preston will argue that he, a financial professional, was helping his aging sick in-laws with their estate planning. He will say that you and your wife willingly decided to gift the house to your only daughter to avoid probate and estate taxes. He will paint it as an act of love and foresight on your part. That's a lie." I interrupted, the heat rising in my voice for the first time. "He is a liar." "I know," she said calmly. "But can you prove it? Were there any witnesses to these conversations? Besides you, your late wife, and Preston? Is there an email, a letter, anything in writing from him that describes this arrangement as a trust?" I thought back, my mind racing. There was nothing. It had all been conversations spoken in the quiet rooms of my house, filled with trust and the assumption of family loyalty. "No," I admitted, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "It was all verbal." She nodded again. "As I thought. So it becomes a he said, she said situation. And in this case, he has a legally binding document with your valid signature on it. To challenge this, we would have to argue that you were either mentally incompetent at the time of signing or that you were under duress or undue influence." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Proving incompetence is nearly impossible unless you had a prior diagnosis of dementia or a similar condition, and proving undue influence is incredibly difficult. It requires demonstrating that Preston exerted so much pressure that it overcame your free will. He will simply say, "He gave you advice and you took it." He has built a legal fortress around himself, Mr. Holloway. The walls are thick and the door is locked. I felt the last of my hope drain away, leaving a cold, hollow void. She was right. Preston had thought of everything. He had used his knowledge of the system to build a perfect trap, and I had walked right into it with my eyes wide open, blinded by love and fear for my wife. The image of Preston's smug face in the window as I drove away flashed in my mind. He had won. It was over. I looked out the window at the city below, all those buildings, all those lives. Each one started with a blueprint, a plan. You couldn't just throw up walls and hope for the best. You had to start with the foundation. If the foundation was bad, the whole structure was compromised no matter how strong the walls looked. I thought about the house, my house. I had designed it to last 100 years. I had poured the foundation myself, making sure it was perfect, strong enough to withstand anything. And suddenly a new thought began to form in my mind. A tiny spark in the darkness. I turned back to Ms. Rosario, who was looking at me with a pained but resolute expression, ready to deliver the final verdict on my hopeless case. I'm sure she was expecting me to sigh in defeat, to ask about her fees, and to shuffle out of her office a broken man. I could see the professional pity in her eyes. But I wasn't broken yet. "Ms. Rosario," I said, my voice finding a new strength I didn't know I had, "you're looking at the signature on the paper, you're looking at the wall Preston built. And you're right, from here, that wall looks solid." I leaned forward, putting my hands on her desk. "But I'm an architect. I spent 40 years of my life designing and building things. And I learned a long time ago that when you come up against a wall, you can't break through. You don't just keep hitting it with your head. You look at the foundation it's built on." I looked her straight in the eye. Preston built his wall on a foundation of lies, greed, and deception. He thinks his paper fortress is impenetrable. But every structure has a weak point. So my question to you is this. I paused, letting the question hang in the air between us. If we can't attack the paper, can we attack the man who made it? The change in her demeanor was immediate. The professional pity in her eyes vanished, replaced by a flicker of sharp, analytical interest. The lawyer who had been ready to dismiss a hopeless case was gone. In her place was a strategist who had just been presented with a new, unexpected angle of attack. She leaned forward, mirroring my posture. A slow, thin smile touched her lips. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice now laced with a new energy. "Tell me everything you know about Preston Thorne, every single detail. Leave nothing out." I left Nina Rosario's office with a new and dangerous feeling, hope. It wasn't the blind, desperate hope I had walked in with. This was different. It was the calculated hope of an architect who has just found a hairline fracture in a concrete wall that everyone else said was unbreakable. Ms. Rosario was right about the quitclaim deed. It was a fortress wall. Trying to attack it head-on would be suicide. But she had also confirmed my new theory. If we could prove that Preston had built that wall on a foundation of fraud and malicious intent, the whole structure could be condemned. The battle had shifted. We were no longer fighting a legal document. We were fighting a man. And to fight a man, you have to know where he's vulnerable. You have to find his secrets. My first stop wasn't home because I had no home. It was a place that held more of my history than any other. A 10 by 20-foot box of corrugated steel in a self-storage facility off the interstate, Unit 34B. For years, Lorraine had complained about the monthly fee for this place. "Gus," she would say, "why are we paying to keep all this old paper?" But I could never bring myself to throw it away. It was my life's work. 40 years of blueprints, contracts, soil reports, and project files, all neatly cataloged and stored in heavy cardboard boxes. I slid the heavy metal door up with a loud groan, and the familiar smell of old paper and dust filled my nostrils. It was the smell of my past. I switched on the single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling and got to work. For the next several hours, I was no longer a grieving, homeless old man. I was Augustus Holloway, architect. I moved with a purpose I hadn't felt in years, my old instincts taking over. I knew my own system. I pulled out boxes labeled Holloway Residence, searching for the original project files from 1978. I unrolled the massive blueprints, their edges brittle with age. I could still remember the feeling of the pencil in my hand as I drew these lines, the excitement of creating a space where my family would grow. But the blueprints weren't what I was looking for. I was looking for the foundation. I dug deeper past the building permits and the inspection reports into the oldest files, the ones that came before a single shovel had broken ground. And then I found it. It was a thin, unassuming file folder bound with a faded rubber band. The label, written in my own younger, neater handwriting, simply said, Holloway Family Land Trust. My heart began to beat faster. I sat down on a dusty box and opened it. Inside were the original documents from the 1970s, and the memory came rushing back as clear as day. The land, the beautiful 2-acre plot, hadn't been bought with our money. It was Lorraine's inheritance, a piece of a larger farm that had belonged to her parents and their parents before them. Her father, a wise, mistrustful old farmer who had seen too many black families lose their land over the years, had insisted on one condition before he gave us his blessing. The house you build on it will be yours, son, he had told me, looking me square in the eye. But the earth beneath it belongs to the Holloway bloodline. You put this land in a trust that no one can touch. Not you, not Lorraine, not any slick-talking banker or lawyer. The land stays. We had done exactly as he said. We had created a separate legal entity, the Holloway Family Land Trust, whose sole purpose was to own and protect that land in perpetuity for our descendants. I read through the legal jargon, my architect's mind seeing the structure within the words. The trust was ironclad, and Preston, in his arrogant modern-day scheming, had committed a fatal error. He had focused on the asset he could see, the house. He had tricked me into signing away the deed to the structure. But he had never thought to investigate the foundation it was built upon. He had no idea that the very ground my house stood on was owned by a legal ghost from the past, a ghost that answered only to me, its sole remaining trustee. A slow smile spread across my face for the first time in what felt like an eternity. I had found the fracture. It wasn't just a hairline crack, it was a fundamental flaw in his entire design. I packed the file into my briefcase, feeling the weight of it like a weapon. It was a powerful weapon, but I knew it might not be enough. A legal battle over competing trusts and deeds could drag on for years. I needed more. I needed to prove not just that Preston had made a mistake, but that he had done it with a black heart. I needed to prove his intent. As I drove away from the storage unit, my mind was racing. How do you prove what's inside a man's head? I was stopped at a traffic light looking at a new modern office building gleaming in the afternoon sun. It was all glass and smart technology, and it hit me. I had been digging through the past through paper and dust, but the proof I needed might be hidden in the present, in the digital world. 3 years ago, there had been a string of break-ins in our neighborhood. Lorraine was terrified. To make her feel safe, I had installed a top-of-the-line security system. It had everything: cameras, motion sensors, and at the salesman's suggestion, microphones in the main living areas. Lorraine had hated that part. "It feels like we're spying on our own family, Gus," she'd said. I had almost turned the feature off, but in the end I'd left it on, reasoning that it was better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. The system came with a cloud storage subscription, saving all audio recordings for the past 90 days. I suddenly felt a cold dread mixed with a surge of adrenaline. The answer might be waiting for me, stored on a server hundreds of miles away. That evening, sitting in the sterile quiet of a temporary hotel room, I logged into the security company's online portal. A calendar appeared with dozens of audio files listed for each day. My heart ached as I saw the dates leading up to Lorraine's passing. I felt like a trespasser in my own life, about to listen in on the private moments of my family's grief. I started with the days after the funeral. I clicked play on the first file. It was just the sound of the house settling, the hum of the refrigerator. I listened to another. It was Zoe crying softly, talking on the phone to a friend. I almost stopped. It felt wrong, like a profound violation. But then I pictured Preston's smug face and I kept going. I spent hours listening. I heard hours of television, the mundane sounds of two people living in a house. I heard Preston on the phone with his clients, his voice smooth and professional. I heard him order takeout. Nothing. My hope began to fade. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe Preston was smart enough not to say anything incriminating in his own home. I was about to give up when I saw a file from the evening of the funeral. It was a long one, over an hour. I clicked play. For the first 10 minutes it was silent. Then I heard the sound of a glass clinking with ice and Preston's voice. He wasn't talking to Zoe, he was on the phone. and his tone was completely different. It was loose, arrogant, celebratory. "Yeah, man, the whole thing is finally done," Preston said, and I could hear the smirk in his voice. "The old lady is in the ground, and the house is officially mine. Well, ours. You know how it is." He laughed. "No, Zoe has no idea about the details. She just thinks we're protecting her dad's legacy. She's got a good heart. Too good. Leaves her blind to how the world really works." My blood ran cold. I leaned closer to the laptop speakers. The person on the other end said something I couldn't make out. Then Preston laughed again, a low, ugly sound. "How'd I get him to sign? Are you kidding me? It was the easiest thing in the world. The old man was so torn up about his wife he would have signed his own death warrant if I told him it would make her comfortable. He just sat there, this sad old man, nodding along while I talked about trusts and tax benefits." There was a pause, and then came the words that would seal his fate. "Look, the old guy worked his whole life for that prime piece of real estate. A classic case of black labor building white wealth. Except this time the wealth came to me on a silver platter, signed, sealed, and delivered. He never saw it coming." I stopped the recording. I sat there in the silence of the hotel room, the ugly racist words echoing in my head. The betrayal was so profound, so much deeper than just money or a house. He hadn't just seen me as a gullible old man. He had seen me as a lesser being, someone whose life's work was simply a resource for him to plunder. The grief I felt was sharp and suffocating, but beneath it, something else was hardening. It was a cold, clear, and absolute resolve. I had found the foundation of his lies, and it was rotten to the core. I now had the blueprint for his destruction, and I was going to bring the whole damned house down on top of him. The next step was the hardest. It required a performance so convincing that it could overcome my daughter's love for me, a love that I knew was now buried under layers of her husband's influence and her own guilt. I sat in the anonymous hotel room, the two key pieces of evidence laid out on the bed before me. The old, fragile file of the land trust and the small, powerful laptop containing the audio file of pure evil. These were my weapons. But a weapon is useless if you can't get your enemy into position. That required one final act of deception. It required me to break my own heart a little by lying to my only child. I picked up the phone and dialed her number, my thumb hovering over the call button. I took a deep breath, pushing down the architect, the fighter, the angry, betrayed father. I had to become someone else. I had to become the man Preston thought I was, a weak, defeated, broken-hearted old man. I pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice, a third time. I could picture her looking at the screen, hesitating, probably asking Preston if she should answer. Finally, she picked up. "Dad." Her voice was small, tentative, a child's voice caught in a storm. "Zoe. Honey." I began letting out a long, weary sigh that I'd been practicing. I made my voice sound rough, as if I'd been crying. I'm sorry if I was cold the other day. I was just in shock. I didn't mean to just walk out like that." On the other end, there was a sound of relief, a small exhale. "Oh, Dad, it's okay. I understand. It's been so hard for everyone." "I know, honey. I know," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I've been doing a lot of thinking these last few days, sitting here in this little hotel room." I let that hang in the air, painting a picture of a lonely old man in a sad, empty room. "You know," I continued, "Preston is right. You two need to move on with your lives. And the house, it's a big asset. It's your future. I'm an old man. I shouldn't be a burden." I could hear a sharp intake of breath from Zoe. "You're not a burden, Dad," she whispered, and I could tell she was starting to cry. Good. Guilt was the key to unlocking the door Preston had slammed in my face. "It's all right, sweetheart," I said, my voice full of false resignation. "I accept it. The house is yours. It's time for me to find a small apartment somewhere. Get out of your hair." I paused, letting her absorb the image of her father being put out to pasture. Then I made my move. "The only thing is, there are just a few of your mother's things, little things, things that wouldn't mean anything to anyone else, but, you know." I let my voice trail off. "What things, Dad?" she asked softly. "Oh, you know, her old gardening books. She made notes in all of them. The little porcelain bird she kept on her bedside table, and the quilt her grandmother made for her when she was a little girl. It's in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed." I made sure to let my voice break on that last part. The silence on the other end was heavy with her sorrow. I can't bear the thought of them being sold or thrown away. Would it be all right if I came by sometime just for an hour? I can pack one small box and I'll be gone. I promise I won't be any trouble. Oh, Daddy, of course, she said immediately, her voice thick with tears. Of course you can. It's still your home. At that moment I heard a muffled sound as if she had covered the receiver with her hand, but the microphone on a modern phone is a powerful thing. I stayed perfectly still listening. I could hear her whispering, her voice strained. It's Dad. He's okay. He just wants to come get a few of Mom's keepsakes. And then I heard his voice, a low, controlling murmur in the background. It was faint, but his words were like shards of ice in my ear. What did I tell you, Zoe? No unscheduled visits. He's trying to manipulate you. Her muffled whisper came back pleading. Preston, he's just sad. He wants a quilt and some books. There was a sigh from Preston, the sound of profound arrogance. Fine, he said, his voice a little clearer now. Tell him Saturday morning, at 10, I'll be here. Tell him he gets exactly 1 hour. We will help him pack to make sure he only takes sentimental junk. Make it clear, Zoe. I don't want him wandering around getting ideas. A moment later, Zoe's voice came back on the line, but all the warmth was gone. It was replaced by a strained formality. Dad, are you there? I'm here, honey, I said softly. Is Saturday morning okay? Around 10, Preston and I will both be here. We can help you find everything to make it quicker. Her words were a near-perfect echo of her husband's command. She was his puppet, and he was pulling the strings right in front of me. This was my final test. I had to swallow the rage, the disgust, the pity I felt for my own daughter. I had to play my part to the very end. Oh, that's very kind of you both, I said, my voice full of pathetic gratitude. Yes, Saturday at 10 is perfect. Thank you, honey. Thank you so much. Okay, Dad. We'll see you then, she said, and quickly hung up. I lowered the phone, the connection severed. I sat in the silence, the performance over. A wave of disgust washed over me, not just for Preston, but for myself, for what I had to do. I had used my daughter's love as a tool, her grief as a key. But as the feeling faded, it was replaced by something cold and hard as granite. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. Preston, in his infinite arrogance, believed he was arranging a supervised visit to manage a feeble old man. He thought he was in complete control. In reality, he had just RSVP'd to his own demolition, and I was going to be the architect of it all. The days leading up to Saturday were a blur of focused activity. The grief was still there, a constant heavy presence in my chest, but now it was accompanied by something new purpose. I met with Nina Rosario every day. Her office, which had once felt so cold and intimidating, now felt like a command center, a war room where the strategy for my life's biggest fight was being meticulously planned. The large glass desk was no longer a barrier between us, but a shared workspace covered in legal documents, timelines, and copies of my old files. Watching Ms. Rosario work was like watching a master craftsman. She was brilliant, relentless, and moved with an efficiency that was breathtaking. She took the raw materials of my story, the pain, the betrayal, the two crucial pieces of evidence I had found, and began forging them into a set of legal weapons so powerful they made my hands tremble. Okay, Gus, she said on Thursday afternoon, sliding 3 thick-bound documents across the desk towards me. This is our arsenal. It's important you understand exactly what each of these does. She pointed to the first thickest document. This is the heart of our attack. It's the official lawsuit filed against Preston Thorne. We are suing him on multiple counts: fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and most importantly, financial elder abuse. She tapped a specific section. This last one is critical. California has very strong laws to protect seniors from predators like your son-in-law. The penalties are severe, including not just the return of all assets, but also punitive damages. It turns this from a family dispute into a serious crime. She looked up at me, her eyes sharp. And the audio recording you found, that is the beating heart of this entire lawsuit. Without it, it's your word against his. With it, it's his own voice confessing his crime. We've had it authenticated by a forensic expert. It is irrefutable. I picked up the document. The language was dense and formal, but the story it told was the simple, ugly truth of what had been done to me. Seeing it all laid out, the long con detailed in cold, hard legal terms, was strangely validating. I wasn't a foolish old man. I was a victim of a calculated predatory crime. Ms. Rosario then pushed the second document forward. It was much shorter. "This," she said, "is our defensive shield. It's an application for a temporary restraining order, or a TRO. Think of this as a financial freeze. The moment the process server hands this to Preston, he is legally forbidden from touching any of your former assets. He can't sell the house. He can't move money out of the accounts. He can't transfer ownership of the cars. Nothing. We are effectively trapping him in the crime scene with all the evidence." She explained that this was vital. Men like Preston, when they sense danger, immediately start hiding assets, moving money offshore, making it impossible to recover. The TRO would slam that door shut before he even knew the storm was coming. Finally, she pointed to the third document. "This one," she said with a hint of a smile, "is the checkmate move. It's what we call a quiet title action. It is a lawsuit that asks a judge to resolve a dispute over the ownership of a piece of property. In it, we are formally challenging the legitimacy of your quitclaim deed." "But you said that deed was legally solid," I reminded her. "Ah," she said, leaning back in her chair. "The deed itself, as a piece of paper you signed, is solid, but the property it describes is not. Preston has a deed to the car, Mr. Holloway. But we are about to prove that you, through the Holloway Family Land Trust, own the private garage the car is parked in, and we are about to present him with a bill for 45 years of back rent." The analogy was perfect. It was the language of an architect. He owned the structure, but I owned the very earth it stood upon. The quitclaim deed was a house of cards built on a foundation of sand, and the land trust was the bedrock that would cause its collapse. With the legal weapons prepared, we shifted our focus to the battlefield, my home. I explained the phone call with Zoe, the arrangement for Saturday at 10 a.m. I told her about Preston's voice in the background, his arrogant instructions. "He's walking right into it," I said. "He thinks he's supervising me, but he's actually the main attraction at his own surprise party." Ms. Rosario listened, a thoughtful expression on her face. "A public confrontation is risky, Gus. It can get messy. His crime was personal." I replied, my voice firm. "His humiliation should be public. He did this in the shadows. I want to drag him into the light." She considered this for a moment, then nodded, a look of grim determination on her face. "You're right. A private serving would allow him to control the narrative, to spin a story to his friends and clients. Doing it this way we burn his reputation to the ground in front of an audience of his own making." The final pieces of the plan fell into place. Ms. Rosario hired a professional process server, a stoic man named Frank, who looked like he could handle any situation. She also made a call to the local sheriff's department. "I'm requesting a civil standby," she explained to me. "It's a request for an officer to be present during a contentious civil matter to ensure the peace is kept. It's not an arrest, but having a uniformed officer present will add a level of authority and prevent Preston from getting physically aggressive. It also makes everything look that much more official." As I signed the final documents, my hand was steady. I thought about the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge is a fire that consumes you. It's chaotic and emotional. Justice, I was learning, is a structure. It's built carefully, piece by piece, with logic, evidence, and the rule of law. What we were planning wasn't a wild act of vengeance. It was a meticulous, calculated demolition. I was no longer just a victim. I was a client, a partner in this process. I was the architect of my own vindication. When everything was done, Ms. Rosario stacked the 3 files neatly together and slid them into a large leather briefcase. She snapped it shut with a loud final click. The sound echoed in the quiet office like a judge's gavel. "The plan is set. The documents are filed with the court. Frank will meet us on your street Saturday morning. The police escort has been confirmed," she said. She looked at me, her professional demeanor softening for just a moment. "Are you ready for this, Mr. Holloway?" I stood up and looked out the window at the city I had helped build, at the buildings that stood tall because their foundations were strong. I felt a sense of calm I hadn't felt since before Lorraine got sick. "I've been designing things my whole life, Ms. Rosario," I said, turning to face her. "This is just one final blueprint, and I assure you it's structurally sound. On Saturday morning, I pulled my old Buick onto the street I had lived on for 45 years, and I knew immediately that I had been a fool to expect anything else. The street was lined with expensive cars. Gleaming German sedans and massive luxury SUVs were parked up and down the curb, a sight more suited to a country club than our quiet tree-lined neighborhood. My heart sank. This wasn't a somber, supervised visit to collect a few keepsakes. This was a party. I parked a block away and walked towards my home, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The front door, the solid oak door I had hung myself, was wide open, and from it spilled the sound of cheerful music and the loud, self-assured laughter of strangers. I stepped over the threshold, and the scene inside hit me like a physical blow. My home, my sanctuary. The quiet repository of a lifetime of memories had been transformed into a cocktail party. There were at least 30 people milling about my living room, men in expensive blazers and women in designer dresses holding glasses of champagne. A catering company had set up a bar where my grandmother's sideboard used to be. They were touching everything, leaning against the walls I had painted, placing their drinks on the bookshelves I had built. It was a desecration, a surreal waking nightmare where I was a ghost haunting my own life. And then I saw him. Preston was in his element. He stood in the center of the room, the lord of the manor, a broad, triumphant smile plastered on his face. He was holding a glass of champagne, gesturing expansively as he spoke to a small circle of admirers. "The bones are good," he was saying, his voice carrying over the music. "I mean, the style is terribly dated, of course. A lot of this dark wood and 70s-era junk will have to go. But the location is killer. You can't buy a 2-acre plot like this in this neighborhood anymore for any price." One of the men, a portly man with a red face, clapped Preston on the back. "You scored Thorn. How'd you ever get the old owners to sell?" Preston let out a theatrical sigh, a performance of false modesty. "It's a delicate situation, Bob. The old man, well, let's just say he wasn't in a position to manage his own affairs anymore. We stepped in to help to ensure the asset was properly managed. It was the responsible thing to do." They all nodded sagely, their faces full of understanding. They were vultures of the same feather men who saw life as a series of assets to be acquired. My eyes scanned the room for my daughter. I found her standing near the large picture window that overlooked Lorraine's rose garden. She was a ghost. She held a glass of water, her knuckles white. She wore a simple black dress that made her look pale and thin. While her husband celebrated, she was still in mourning. Her shoulders were slumped and her eyes were fixed on the garden, on the last of the autumn roses her mother had so carefully tended. She looked lost, a prisoner in her own home. She saw me then, and for a fleeting moment her eyes widened with a look of desperate relief. She took a step towards me as if to run to her father to find refuge. But Preston, who seemed to have a sixth sense for any threat to his control, saw the movement. He smoothly excused himself from his circle of friends, walked over to Zoe, and slid a possessive arm around her waist. "Honey," he said, his voice a low command. "Come on. I was just telling Richard about our plans for the kitchen renovation." He steered her away from me, back into the crowd, his smile never faltering. He had cut her off from her only lifeline, isolating her completely. In that moment, my anger hardened into something cold and pure. I wasn't just here to get my house back. I was here to rescue my daughter. I forced my feet to move, to walk deeper into the room. I needed to see it all. I needed to burn this final image of his arrogance into my memory to fuel me for what was about to happen. Preston had moved over to the fireplace, the one I had built with field stones we'd collected from a trip upstate. He picked up a small, hand-carved wooden bird from the mantelpiece. It was a little wren worn smooth with time. Lorraine had bought it from a local craftsman on our 25th wedding anniversary. It was her favorite. Preston held it up between his thumb and forefinger, a look of contempt on his face. "Can you believe the kind of junk they had cluttering up this place?" he said to the woman next to him. "It's like a museum of bad taste. I'll probably get $1 for this little thing at Goodwill." He tossed it carelessly back onto the mantel where it clattered against the stone. My fists clenched at my sides. Every instinct in me screamed to lunge at him, to wipe that smug look off his face, but I held myself in check. Not yet. The performance wasn't over. My part was yet to come. I walked through the crowd, an invisible old man in his own home. People glanced at me, their eyes quickly dismissing me as one of the catering staff or perhaps a poor relation of the new owners. I overheard snippets of their conversations. They talked of property values, of renovations, of tearing down walls. They were talking about erasing my life, erasing Lorraine, and they were doing it while drinking champagne and eating canapés. The contrast between the festive celebratory atmosphere and the profound sadness I saw in my daughter's eyes was a stark illustration of the evil that had taken over my family. Preston was not just a thief. He was a desecrator of memories, a man who celebrated on the grave of the woman whose kindness he had exploited. He was feasting on the ruins of our life. I finally made my way to the center of the room, stopping a few feet away from Preston's group. I just stood there waiting. It took him a full minute to even notice me. When he finally did, his triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of annoyance. He clearly hadn't expected me to just walk into the middle of his party. He smoothly detached himself from his conversation and walked towards me, his demeanor shifting into one of condescending patience, the kind one uses for a difficult child. "Ah, Gus," he said, his voice loud enough for those around him to hear. "Right on time. Come to pack up your little trinkets." He gestured vaguely towards a corner where 3 empty cardboard boxes had been placed, a pathetic, insulting offering. He looked at his expensive watch. "Well, your hour starts now. Try not to get in the way of the guests." He turned to walk away, his dismissal absolute. He had just made the final, fatal mistake of underestimating the old man he had so thoroughly wronged. He didn't know that my hour wasn't just starting. His time was already up. Preston looked at his watch, a picture of dismissive authority. "Well, your hour starts now," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Try not to get in the way of the guests." He turned to walk away, expecting me to scurry off to a corner like a chastened servant. But I didn't move. I just stood there in the center of my living room, and held his gaze. The quiet defiance in my stance, the fact that I wasn't immediately obeying, seemed to short-circuit his brain. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He opened his mouth to say something else, something undoubtedly cruel, but he was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Its clear, simple chime cut through the music and chatter, bringing an abrupt halt to the party. Every head in the room turned towards the door. Preston, irritated by the interruption to his performance, strode over and pulled it open, and the entire atmosphere of the room changed in a heartbeat. Standing on my porch were 4 people. The first was Nina Rosario, looking impeccable and formidable in a dark pantsuit holding a leather briefcase. Beside her stood a large stoic man in a plain suit who was clearly not here for champagne, and behind them, standing formally on the walkway, were 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies. The sight of the uniform sucked all the air out of the room. The music suddenly seemed to stop. The cheerful chatter died in people's throats. Champagne glasses were lowered. This was no longer a party. It was an official proceeding. Preston's jaw tightened. He tried to recover to maintain control. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a tight-clipped version of his earlier confidence. Ms. Rosario stepped forward, her heels clicking decisively on the oak floor I had laid myself. "We're here for Mr. Preston Thorne," she said, her voice calm and clear, projecting through the silent room. The large man, Frank, stepped forward, holding a thick stack of legal documents. "Preston Thorne," he said, his voice a flat, unemotional baritone. "You've been served." He extended the papers. Preston stared at them as if they were a coiled snake. For a moment he didn't move. Then with a sneer, he snatched them from Frank's hand. He began to leaf through the top pages, his eyes scanning the legal text. His face, which had been a mask of confident ownership, began to contort. I saw confusion, then disbelief, then a dark flush of rage. He looked up from the papers, his eyes locking onto me. "What is this nonsense?" he spat, waving the lawsuit in the air. "Are you serious? You're suing me, this senile old man?" He gestured towards me, his voice dripping with venom. "Is trying to sue me, and you." He turned on Ms. Rosario. "You must be some kind of bottom-feeding, ambulance-chasing lawyer to take on a ridiculous case like this." The guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering amongst themselves. They were witnessing a scene far more dramatic than they had anticipated. Ms. Rosario was unfazed. She simply reached into her briefcase and took out a small, sleek black Bluetooth speaker. She placed it on the marble coffee table in the center of the room. "My client is not senile, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "And our case is not ridiculous. Before you continue to defame him, perhaps you and your guests should listen to the key piece of evidence." With a tap of her finger on her phone, the room was filled with his voice, his real voice, the loose, arrogant, celebratory voice I had heard in the hotel room. The recording was crystal clear. "The old lady is in the ground. "And the house is officially mine," his recorded voice boasted. A collective gasp went through the room. People looked at each other, then at Preston, their eyes wide with shock. Zoe made a small, strangled sound, her hand flying to her mouth. Preston's face went white. He looked around wildly, as if trying to find the source of the sound, as if he could somehow stop his own words from betraying him. The recording continued, each word a nail in his coffin. "How'd I get him to sign? Are you kidding me? It was the easiest thing in the world. The old man was so torn up about his wife he would have signed his own death warrant." The guests began to physically back away from him, creating a circle of empty space around him. The man they had been congratulating moments before was now a pariah. Then came the final devastating lines. "The old guy worked his whole life for that prime piece of real estate. A classic case of black labor building white wealth. Except this time the wealth came to me on a silver platter." At the word black, the energy in the room shifted from shock to outright disgust. In this crowd of wealthy, image-conscious people, there was nothing more toxic than being exposed as a blatant, proud racist. It was a social death sentence. I looked at Zoe. Tears were streaming down her face, her body shaking with silent sobs. The man she had married, the man she had defended, had just been revealed as a monster in front of the whole world. The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Zoe's heartbroken cries. Preston stood frozen, his face a mottled canvas of scarlet and ghostly white. He looked like a man who had just watched his own soul being publicly dissected. Ms. Rosario let the silence stretch for a long, painful moment. Then she spoke again, her voice cutting through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "As you have all just heard," she said, addressing the entire room, "this was not a case of responsible estate planning. This was a calculated case of fraud and financial elder abuse motivated by greed and racial animus." She then turned her full attention to Preston, who seemed to be shrinking inside his expensive suit. "And that brings us to our second point, Mr. Thorne. You went to great lengths to fraudulently obtain the deed to this house, a very impressive structure." She paused, letting him hang on her every word. "But you made a critical oversight, a fatal flaw in your design." She took a step forward. "You see, while you may have a piece of paper for the car, you seem to have forgotten that the Holloway Family Land Trust owns the private garage it is parked in. This land, the very ground this house is built on, has been the protected property of the Holloway family for generations. It was never Mr. Holloway's to give away, and it was certainly never yours to take." A wave of confused murmurs went through the crowd. Preston just stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, the gears in his cunning mind finally grinding to a halt. He didn't understand. "And you, sir," Ms. Rosario continued, her voice ringing with absolute authority, "are trespassing." Preston finally found his voice a desperate, sputtering rage. That's insane. I have the deed. This is my house." Ms. Rosario didn't even glance at him. She turned to the senior sheriff's deputy, who had been standing impassively by the door. "Deputy," she said, her voice calm and formal, "as you can see from the documents you've reviewed and as you have now heard with your own ears, a crime has been committed. Furthermore, Mr. Thorne and his guests are currently trespassing on private property owned by my client's trust. We require your assistance in having them vacate the premises immediately." The deputy, a tall, stern-looking man, nodded once. He stepped forward, his presence filling the room with an undeniable authority. His hand rested casually on his sidearm. He looked directly at Preston. "Sir," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "this is now a civil matter to be decided by the courts. But for now, based on the documentation I've seen, you are on private property without the owner's permission. I am going to have to ask you and all your guests to gather your personal belongings and leave." For a moment I thought Preston might explode, but faced with the calm certainty of the law, he just deflated. The arrogance, the confidence, the cruelty, it all evaporated, leaving behind a pale, trembling, pathetic man. He looked around at the faces of his former friends, who now stared back at him with nothing but contempt. The great exodus began. In a surreal procession of shame, the wealthy guests hurried to grab their coats and purses, avoiding eye contact with me, with Preston, with anyone. They filed out the door, their champagne flutes left half empty, their party turning into a public disgrace. I stood there and watched it all. I watched the empire of lies Preston had built crumble into dust in a matter of minutes. I watched as my daughter, her face a mask of utter devastation, was led out by a friend. She wouldn't even look at me. And finally I watched as Preston, the last to leave, stood on the porch, a man without a home, without a reputation, without a future. The deputy closed the door behind him and the latch clicked shut. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was silence in my house. It was no longer a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the clean, quiet, and beautiful sound of justice. The weeks that followed the confrontation were quiet. The silence in my house returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't heavy with grief or thick with tension. It was clean, empty, and full of potential, like a cleared building site waiting for a new design. I spent my days slowly reclaiming my space, moving furniture back to its rightful place, erasing the memory of the party of the strangers who had treated my home like a showroom. Ms. Rosario kept me updated on the fallout. The aftermath for Preston was swift and total. It was a demolition in every sense of the word. The district attorney's office, armed with the audio recording and my testimony, opened a full criminal investigation into Preston for felony financial elder abuse. His name was in the local papers not as a successful wealth manager, but as a predator. The state licensing board immediately suspended his credentials, effectively ending his career. But the most satisfying part was what happened next. Like turning over a rock and watching the insects scatter, the publicity of my case prompted several of his other elderly clients to come forward. They came with their own stories of confusing paperwork, of assets mysteriously underperforming, of being gently pushed into investments that only benefited Preston. A massive class action lawsuit was being formed. He was financially ruined, professionally disgraced, and socially radioactive. His shallow, wealthy friends had abandoned him instantly. He had built his entire life on a foundation of lies, and I had simply pulled out the cornerstone. The rest had collapsed on its own. About a month after that day, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Zoe standing on the porch. I hadn't seen or spoken to her since she'd been led crying from the house. She looked smaller somehow. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. Her face was pale and tired, but her eyes, for the first time in years, were clear. She was holding a small box. "These are Mom's gardening books," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I found them. You left without them." I took the box from her. Our hands brushed, and she flinched as if expecting me to pull away. I simply nodded and held the door open. "Come in, Zoe." She sat on the edge of the sofa, the same sofa where Lorraine had sat when Preston spun his web of lies. She didn't speak for a long time, just looked at her hands, which were twisted together in her lap. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes swimming with tears that she didn't try to hide. "I'm so sorry, Dad." She whispered the words, sounding like they had been trapped inside her for years. There's no excuse. I know that. I knew something was wrong. I felt it. In my gut. Every time he talked about money, every time he dismissed you or Mom, I felt it. But I was a coward. I was so caught up in the lifestyle and the image in him. I was so afraid of his anger. So I let it happen. I let him poison everything. I let him hurt you. And I stood by and did nothing. I am so sorry. Her confession was raw and real. There were no excuses, no attempts to shift the blame. It was the first honest thing I had heard from her in years. A part of my heart, the father part, wanted to rush over and hold her, to tell her it was all okay, that we could fix it. But the man who had been so deeply betrayed knew that would be a lie. Easy forgiveness would be an insult to the pain I had endured and an insult to the memory of her mother. I sat down in my armchair across from her. I looked at my daughter, this woman I loved more than life itself, and I told her the hard truth. "Trust Zoe," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Trust is like the foundation of a house. You can't see it. Most of the time you don't even think about it, but everything, absolutely everything, is built on top of it. Our foundation, yours and mine, it's not cracked. It's shattered. It's rubble." I saw the pain in her eyes as my words hit her, but I continued. "You can't just patch a shattered foundation. It doesn't work that way. The whole structure will be unstable forever. The only thing you can do is excavate. You have to clear away all the rubble piece by painful piece. You have to get back down to the solid ground. It's slow, difficult, back-breaking work, and you can't be sure what you'll be able to build on it afterwards." She was openly weeping now, her shoulders shaking. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I'm saying that the relationship we had is gone," I said, and the finality of it hurt me as much as it hurt her. It was destroyed by lies. "I will always be your father, Zoe. I will always love you. But I don't know if I can ever be your dad again, not in the same way. That man trusted you without question. He is gone. If we are to have anything between us again, it has to be new. It has to be built on honesty, and you will have to earn that trust back one small piece at a time, and it might take a very, very long time." She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She just nodded, accepting my terms. It was a painful, brutal conversation, but it was a necessary one. It was the first honest conversation we'd had in years, the first step on that long road back to solid ground. She left a few minutes later. I stood at the window and watched her walk to her modest second-hand car. I felt no triumph, no joy in her pain. I only felt a profound sense of loss for the family that had been, for the daughter I had raised, and for the years we had lost to a lie. But as she drove away, a new feeling began to settle over me. The truth, no matter how painful, was finally out in the open. The ground was cleared. The ashes were swept away. And for the first time, I felt a quiet sense of peace. This whole experience taught me a profound lesson, one that goes far beyond property deeds and legal battles. A house is just a structure of wood and stone, a thing that can be valued and stolen. But a home is built on a foundation of trust, love, and respect. When that foundation is attacked, you cannot simply patch the visible cracks. You must have the courage to excavate, to expose the rot deep within, and to fight for the very ground you stand on. True strength isn't just in what you build, it's in what you're willing to protect. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.